Welcome, everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce Amzi Jeffs from the University of Washington. And today he'll be telling us about sunflower theorems and convex codes. Thanks, Amzi.
Yeah, thank you, Henry, for the intro, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me. I'm excited to give this talk, and I really appreciate everyone showing up, especially in the current circumstances. I know it's hard to, feel like we're able to sort of engage with math and other things, everything else going on in the world. And yeah, just wanted to say I appreciate everyone being here and taking the time to check it out. So I'm going to talk about sunflower theorems and convex codes. Full disclosure, this is my first time presenting on this particular computer, so if there are technical difficulties, please let me know immediately and I'll try and deal with them. And I just want to start off with sort of an introduction to what this field of research really is. Broadly it's motivated by some neuroscience, but most of this talk is going to be focused on sort of the theoretical discrete geometry approach to understanding this neuroscience question. But the neuroscience that's here is actually really cool, and so I wanted to share that and start off with kind of a video of what the phenomenon we're trying to understand is. And the story here starts in 1971. There were a couple of experimental scientists who discovered place cells in the rat hippocampus. And so what these are, I'll show you a video in a second. It's actually much more recent from 2019, but roughly these are single neurons in the brain which sort of record where an animal is in its environment. Their activity somehow corresponds to the animal's position. And let me see if I can actually figure out how to share this other part of the screen. Can people see?
We don't, you might want to exit full screen in your PDF slides. Okay,
yep,
now
okay.
we see the
see
YouTube video.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Cool. I'll start the video again. So this is a rat running around in a little square box. Each color that we see is a neuron firing. So there are 10 neurons here. Each one has a separate color. And what we see emerge sort of over time, this is obviously a sped up video, is that certain neurons are sort of active in certain areas of the rat's environment. This red neuron in the bottom right is sort of somehow telling the brain, okay, the rat is in this bottom right region. And likewise, the yellow one is more concentrated in the middle of the box, and so forth. This is really kind of interesting behavior, that single neurons can kind of correspond to a position in space. And let me switch back to my slides.
So Amzi, actually, sorry.
Yes.
There are just the, I guess this might be jumping the gun a little bit, but it's none, it just looks like that there's kind of, some of the regions are disconnected. Is that just the colors look similar? Like I see, there's kind of like in the lower left corner, there's some like purple and pink spots. That's the same as the pink that's in like the upper right? Is that?
Yeah, so I think, so what this experiment shows is, and what you're pointing out is that it's definitely not perfect.
Okay.
This, like you're pointing out, this pink one in the top right, there are sort of areas in the bottom left that I think that is correct. These aren't just the purple that's kind of similar. There are some places the pink neuron fires down there. But by and large, the pink neuron is firing in the upper right. So
okay, sure.
The times we would see it fire are when we expect to be in the top right. Maybe we got unlucky and it fired down in the bottom left as well. And I don't know too much about the neuroscience. This might be about all that I say about it. But I wanted to show this video and this kind of picture and motivate a little bit of the theoretical framework with it. So these place cells we can think about as sort of encoding a map that the animal has in its brain of its environment. And the question that we want to answer from a mathematical perspective is like, how much can these neurons really tell us about the environment? They can't, tell us everything. It's just, a single neuron can't tell us everything. 10 neurons is not sort of complex enough to encode every possible thing about the environment, but how much can they tell us? In particular, like topologically, what can we sort of recover? Geometrically, what can they recover? And so the mathematical model of this is sort of, the name for it is convex neural codes. And the way it's set up is as follows. This was sort of formulated in 2013 by Curto et al. And what we're going to do is we're just going to label our neurons 1 through n. Here, square brackets n will denote the set 1 through n. And each neuron sort of fires in a, if we go back to this picture, very roughly a convex open subset of our environment. That's the approximation we're going to use in this talk, is convex and open for these places these cells are firing. And of course, they're firing discretely, but we can sort of look at the blob where they're most likely to be active. And as the rat walks around, certain neurons might fire either at the same time or close to the same time. And so at any point in time, we can just record a list of all the neurons that fire and collect all those lists together. And when I collect them all together, I'm going to call the resulting set of lists that I get a convex neural code. So formally, this is just some subset of a power set on n elements. And let's just do an example. So here's a very simple example of just 3 neurons. I have sets U1, U2, and U3. So U3, for example, is where neuron 3 I'm thinking about as being active and firing. When I'm in this highlighted gray region, for example, that's going to give me 2, 3. That's the list of neurons I'm going to write down because I'm in set 2 and set 3, but I'm not in set 1. So neuron 1 we shouldn't expect to be firing here.
Question, please.
Yeah.
Is this related all to any of the spiking neural codes by Bialik? Some old work on that?
Sorry, could you repeat the last part? You said
his name was Bialik, B-I-A-L-E-K. He wrote a book on spiking neuron codes.
That I'm not actually familiar with.
So I can jump in here, actually. I'm a neuroscientist. So
okay.
Yeah, Bialik's book is basically just about coding via discrete events called spikes. And so what you're looking at here is something called a rate code, which is effectively a time average of the spiking activity of a specific cell. So what he showed before in the color codes would be individual spikes.
Yeah.
Most likely. And so, yeah, this is just an average, a temporal average.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That sounds accurate to my knowledge. And I guess the way we're sort of thinking about recording these is, yeah, we'll have a bunch of spiking data as we go through time. And then we're just sort of placing time windows over that and saying, if we have spikes from different neurons in the same time window, I'm going to record those neurons as firing, if not exactly at the same time, but like together. And so we end up kind of just a discrete recording of all this activity. Yeah, okay, so in this example, like I said, 2, 3 comes from this kind of gray region. The empty set comes from anywhere that you're not in these 3 sets, if you're sort of outside of the 3 sets. Likewise, the singleton set 2 comes from being over on this left-hand side where set 2 is present, but the others are not. And again, just sort of the formal terminology we're using. So a code is any subset of the power set on n elements. I'm always going to assume I have the empty set just for convenience in this talk. And if I ever say code word, that just means an element of a code. And I'm going to put up this formal definition, but we don't have to worry too much about it. So if I have a collection of convex open sets, let's say script U, and I have 1 through n sets, I can write down the code that this collection of sets would give rise to if I'm thinking about them as coming from these neurons. And so how do I do that? Well, I look at all my points in d-dimensional space, and at every point, I write down the sets that that point is in, and I collect together all those labels, and I get some code. And if I can do this, if I can find for a given code this collection of sets that give rise to it, I'll call that a realization. And whenever a code has a realization like this consisting of convex open sets, I'm going to call it a convex code. And so, yeah, again, just the framework we're working in here, we're sort of thinking of these as corresponding to these place cells. These UIs correspond to place cells. And this code has the advantage that it's sort of just reporting which neurons are going to fire roughly at the same time if we observed neural activity. So this code is actually something that's not depending too much on the geometry of the sets. It's something we could observe. It's sort of something that exists within the brain in some sense. Okay, so let's put this terminology into practice and start getting a little bit more towards the math. So here I have this same example we already saw. This is a realization of this code C, which has 6 code words. We have 3 sets in R2. And so this code I'm going to call a convex code because here's a realization of it. Okay, I'm going to ask for a small amount of audience participation. How about this code here, which has 5 code words and 3 neurons? Can you think about how a drawing would look in R2? And so this is saying I have the empty set, so there's somewhere that my sets don't all cover. I have singleton sets, so I might see a set by itself. And then I have somewhere that I see all 3 sets at once. Would somebody be willing to hazard a guess as to how this might look? Or maybe, I don't know, can we do it at all?
Yeah, so in 2D, I want to do like a three-pointed star. So the 3 sets all intersect at the spoke, but then they stick out.
Yes, I think that's a good way to think of it. We have somewhere the sets all meet together and then they kind of spoke or like come off it. And here's one, I mean, you could draw many drawings. Here's one of them. This sort of square region in the middle is where 1, 2, 3 would be. And then I have my sets U1, U2, and U3 kind of coming off of it. And notice we can't do this in R1 because I kind of need a second dimension to have this U3 poke out of this place where U1 and U2 meet. This is an example we can do in R2, but not R3. I'm sorry, not R1. Cool. So the big picture in this talk is, if you hand me a code, when can I find some sets that realize it? And in particular, like what do those sets have to satisfy? How much of their geometry and combinatorics actually gets recorded in the code itself? And our motivation is, understanding, again, from a very theoretical mathematical perspective, like how much can place cells sort of know about the environment they're recording or perceiving. Actually, in this talk, we're going to restrict to something that's even a little bit more special, which is how much can the code tell us about the dimension in which you find those sets. So we just saw an example where we could do it in R2, but not R1. So how do I sort of recognize those types of phenomenon in general? And of course, if we're thinking about spatial data, we wouldn't really expect a dimension higher than 3 usually. But there are sort of other senses and things that people care about studying that might have higher dimensional sort of stimulus, for example, sound or smell or things along those lines. And of course, we want to talk about some cool discrete geometry, and that we can do in any dimension we feel like. Okay, so let me start off by talking a little bit about the mathematics sort of behind this and what people have been able to say so far. This will be an incomplete list of previous results, but they'll be sort of the ones that are most relevant for this talk. So to get my hands on this notion of dimension for a code, how much can it recognize about dimension? I'm just going to define something called open embedding dimension, and it's going to be the smallest integer d so that I can find a realization of my code in that dimension. Of course, if I can find a realization in RD, I can find it in a higher dimension just by taking cylinders over the sets that I have. But as we saw, we might not be able to go all the way down to R1. And if I can't find a realization, I'll set this just to be infinity by convention. So this example we saw before, this one has open embedding dimension no more than 2, so I could find a realization in R2, but actually I could flatten all these sets to get a realization in R1. So this convex code we saw before has open embedding dimension equal to 1.
Hi. I have a quick question about about this slide. So is there a particular reason why you choose to embed in RD? Why not some other space?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think one, there's already sort of a lot to work on and try and understand in RD. Like it's already a very hard question to understand in RD, and moving to other spaces would be kind of even harder. I think people would be interested in that, especially on like there's sort of a neuroscience motivation for looking at tori as well, but that's not something that people have actively pursued yet. I guess the other advantage of RD is like there's a lot of math we can sort of leverage that already exists to understand convex sets in RD. And that's the other thing too, is if we have a notion of convex RD, if we need a notion of convex, RD is sort of the easiest place to describe that. Of course, you could do like things with geodesics and stuff like that to sort of think about quote unquote convex sets in other spaces. That's part of it as well.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, so that one that I just showed has open embedding dimension 1. This one that we saw before has open embedding dimension 2. Here's my realization in R2, and I sort of briefly mentioned that we cannot sort of flatten this into a line. And one other example I wanted to give is just this very simple code with 3 different code words and 3 neurons. And here I claim that I can never find a realization no matter how big my space is. And why is that? So the code, if I look at neuron 2, it shows up with 1 and 3, but it never shows up by itself, and 1 and 3 don't overlap. So in any realization, this would say that U2 is the disjoint union of U1 and U3, and that's not possible with even connected sets. And so, yeah, I can never find a realization of this in any dimension. Cool. So
let me interrupt really quick. There's a question in the chat window. Should there be open convex realization in the definition of ODIM? I thought there sort of was. These are open sets. Well, it's not on the slide, but earlier, yeah. You're assuming all the sets are open. Yeah.
I am. Yeah. Thanks for bringing that up, because in this talk, every set I use in a realization is going to be open, and there are places people care about, like closed sets and things like that. I can maybe talk in the question session at the end about sort of how to think about that. But yeah, we want our sets to be topologically nice, because if they're not open or closed, then things get kind of nasty.
Thanks.
Yeah. Cool. So some past work that people have done. There are plenty of examples where the open embedding dimension is infinite, where I can't find a realization. One sort of classical tool for this is to use topological arguments, like the one I just gave about disconnectedness, but you can generalize that much more. On the other hand, if you do have a convex code, if you can find a realization, the dimension is bounded above in some sort of way. I can think of my code words as partially ordered by inclusion, look at the number of maximal ones, and it turns out that's a bound on the open embedding dimension if the open embedding dimension is finite. And you might be interested in lower bounds too. If I hand you, a code on n neurons, you might want to know what is the sort of worst case for how large the embedding dimension could get. And past results talked about, again, sort of topological ways to understand this. And in particular, past results there weren't any examples of codes whose open embedding dimension was larger than the number of neurons. And one particularly interesting family of codes is those that are intersection complete, which just means the intersection of 2 code words is always going to be in my code. And for these, we actually get some pretty nice behavior. So one thing is that I always can find a realization. So this is a result from 2016. And in this talk, that's sort of the class of codes we're going to focus on, is these ones where we know we can find a realization, but we don't actually know exactly what the worst case for open embedding dimension could be. So yeah, just broadly, the question in this talk is going to be, among all these intersection complete codes on n neurons, how large can my open embedding dimension actually get? And the topological intuition from these past results, and also just from other classical discrete geometry results, as well as just maybe vague intuition about like general position and things like that, sort of indicate that maybe the answer to this question should be that the open embedding dimension can never get larger than the number of neurons. But if you read the abstract, you know that will not end up being the case. So we'll get there. And the main tool we're going to sort of use to end up proving this is something called sunflowers of convex open sets. And I want to spend a couple minutes sort of introducing what those are and why they end up actually playing a role in this question. Okay, so let me just fix some notation. If I have a set of indices, I'm going to let U sub sigma denote the intersection of all the UIs, so pi and sigma. And if I have a collection of convex sets, I'm going to call it a sunflower if its code has a certain structure. So I'm going to include the set 1 through n as a code word, which means all my sets intersect somewhere together at once. And then I'm also going to include singleton sets in the empty set. Okay, so the UI I'm going to call petals in this, and U sub n, where all the sets intersect, I'm going to call the center. And let me draw some pictures to kind of motivate this. So in this case, on the left, I have 3 petals in R2, and the center is this kind of triangular region. In the middle here, I've got 3 petals in R3, and they're kind of coming off of a cube, which is the center of this sunflower. And over here on the right-hand side, I have a star that gives me 5 petals in R2, for example. And actually, earlier in the talk, we saw another example of 3 petals in R2. That was that code that I asked for somebody to describe a realization of. And one of the reasons that we care about these things, so I mean, they consist of convex open sets, so probably they have something to do with this question about codes. But it turns out they have some nice structure that we can talk about. So here is a lemma from Lane, Camper, Shu, and Woodstock in 2015. And what they're able to prove is that if I have a sunflower with 3 petals in R2, and I choose a point in every petal, then the convex hull of those points has to contain a point in the center of my sunflower. And just a reminder, the convex hull, in this case, since I have 3 points, it's just the triangle whose vertices are P1, P2, and P3. And this is actually special to R2. If I move up a dimension, then this result no longer actually applies. And I am, full disclosure, stating this slightly differently than these authors did in their original paper, but I'm stating it this way because I want to, on the next slide, give a generalization of this as well. But let me just show you an example, and perhaps I'll try and annotate on this. So here are 3 different examples. On the left-hand side, I have a sunflower with 3 petals in R2, so this theorem should apply, right? And if I choose, let's say, these 3 points from each of my petals and draw the triangle whose vertices are those points, lo and behold, it does actually have to go through the center of my sunflower. Likewise over here, even though these are in sort of a different format, these 3 petals, if I choose my 3 points and draw the triangle with those vertices, then it has to hit the center of my sunflower as well. On the other hand, here in R3, if I have 3 petals, I can kind of choose some points that are way off on the ends of my petals, take the convex hull, and this triangle is going to be sort of removed from the center. It's going to be closer to us in this drawing, coming off of the screen, whereas the center is farther back. And the reason this is useful for understanding this convex codes question is that it gives us examples of codes that are not convex in any dimension, but the reason they're not convex is no longer a topological argument. It's really a geometric one based on this type of theorem. This is actually a really nice result when it came out, because people had conjectured that maybe, topology is the only thing that can go wrong, and otherwise you can make a drawing of your code. This result gave you an example where that is no longer true. Topology is not sort of the only thing these codes are capturing. Is one way to think about this. Okay, so let me sort of make an analogous statement about sunflowers in general. So that was sunflowers with 3 petals in R2. So what if I have a sunflower with D plus 1 petals in RD? Well, we might expect that the same kind of statement would hold, and in fact it does. And so the statement is, if I choose a point from each petal in RD, and then take the convex hull of that, that's just the smallest convex set containing all those points, then it also has to hit the center of my sunflower. And again, this bound of RD is tight. If I move up a single dimension, then I can no longer make this claim. And I just want to make a short comment on the actual proof of this. The original proof that I had in this 2018 paper was quite awful, frankly. It worked, but was not very nice. But there is a nicer proof that uses Verdon's theorem, and this was actually suggested by G. Rosen, and later on in this talk we'll see actually a even slightly more general statement than this one that I just made, and talk about how the proof of that would actually imply the proof of this in a nice way. The other thing to notice here that is kind of interesting is, this result is really, really not correct if you no longer have open sets. So here's a sunflower consisting of convex sets in R2. The sets are closed now, and they're just line segments that needed a point. And of course, I get to choose P1, P2, etc. from each of these petals, take the convex hull, and that's not going to hit the center, quote unquote, center region, which in this case is this single point up top. So we really do need open sets in this case. So this is not only something that's capturing non-topological information, it's capturing sort of information that's specific to thinking about realizations with open sets. Yeah, so there's a number of applications you can make of this type of result to codes, but one that I want to state, and we're going to actually draw back in later, is the following. So I can define a family of codes. I'll just call them script S sub n. And what are the code words I'm going to include in this? So I'm going to include every singleton set, every pair containing the set n plus 1, or containing the neuron n plus 1, the empty set, and then the set of neurons 1 through n. And so what am I describing here? I'm describing a situation where U1 through UN form a sunflower, and then this n plus first set sort of slices through all the petals but does not touch the center of the sunflower. And so my claim is that the open embedding dimension of this code actually is equal to n. And why is that true? So we know, based on what I just described, that I cannot sort of slice off more petals than the dimension that I'm living in. And so this has to actually live in dimension at least equal to n. And that's just applying this result from the previous slide. And on the other hand, we can actually form a realization of this code by just taking the coordinate axes, sort of thickening them appropriately, and then taking this n plus first set to be a hyperplane that kind of slices through them with coordinate vector equal to, for example, the all ones vector. And just to give you a picture of this, so here's an example of S3 in R3. I have my thickened coordinate axes, sort of at a weird angle here, and then this hyperplane that's slicing through all of them. And so this result is kind of saying, in code's language, that I can't make a drawing like this one that I just gave you here that's in R2. I have to go up to R3. And in general, if I have n petals, I have to move all the way up to Rn.
Amzi, just give me a second. I'm trying to parse this. So so Sn is this picture that you've drawn down below. I see you've drawn S3, and you have every singleton. You have every two set containing n plus 1. So n plus 1, the set n plus 1 here is your set on the bottom. Okay.
Yeah, pardon my handwriting on this touchpad, but yeah, the sets U1, U2, and U3 are these sort of three arms that are coming off the top, and then UN plus 1, so U4 in this case would be the bottom one.
And then you say the code words are every singleton, every two set containing n plus 1. Oh, I see, and n. So that is saying that 1, 2, and 3 intersect. Gotcha.
Yeah, so 1, 2, and 3 are intersecting up here. That's where that.
I'm with you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
And so this is just when UN plus 1 is some arbitrary open set, and it's just for dimension. So it's, I guess the result is just dimension of an open convex realization.
Yeah, so the SNs are codes, and this result is saying when, like, in what dimension can I find a realization, and the dimension has to be at least n is sort of the result. So these SNs are just, yeah, combinatorial objects, codes. But if I want to draw the geometric realization of them, I have to be in a large enough dimension. And again, there's nothing topologically that tells us about this. This really is sort of a statement about convexity and openness that's implying this is sort of the reason that this is interesting, I guess.
Because didn't you have a result? Like if we force UN plus 1 to be like convex or maybe a hyperplane or something, wasn't that it? Then you could go even farther and just say, like, not just it had an open dimension. Not that its open embedding dimension was just had to be this, but there was no. It couldn't be convex at all. Was there some result like that?
Yeah. So the original paper from 2018, where I proved this result from the previous slide. In this one, I actually didn't formulate this result that I just stated on this slide. The way that I used this theorem there was to generate new examples, sort of in the spirit of this 2015 paper. I generated examples of codes that are not convex at all. Whereas what I've just shown on this slide is codes that are convex, but the dimension sort of gets large. So there is more than one application of this theorem to the codes sort of stuff. Yeah, I'm giving, this one is different than that 2018 paper for sure. But there are ways to extend it.
Because what I was, okay, so sorry, I know I've been talking a lot, but what I was trying to get to was do you know if it's the case that if this UN+1, if the only way you could avoid getting the UN+1 to hit everything except the center would be to make UN+1 non-convex? Basically, essentially what you have is that you kind of run into the issue of either UN+1 kind of bends around and it's not convex, or it has to touch the U sub i's. Is that true?
That's exactly right. And,
okay.
And yeah, in the realizations that I just described, this UN+1 is a thickened hyperplane.
Okay.
But yeah, this result applies no matter how you draw UN+1. And,
okay.
And actually, it being a hyperplane is sort of an equivalent question, because if it was not a hyperplane, you could take a separating hyperplane between this UN+1 and the center region, and that would have to slice through all the petals. Yeah, so there's various ways to kind of phrase and formulate this, but yeah, this applies for any convex open sets you would want to use to draw your code.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I promised some sort of interesting surprise about open embedding dimension, but here the number of neurons is n+1, and the open embedding dimension is n, so the number of neurons is still larger than the embedding dimension. Where's the surprise I promised? Let's get to that in the next section. So there are a number of ways to sort of phrase the stuff I'm about to talk about, but I wanted to put a little bit of notation on it to try and make it nice. And the sort of notions I'm going to talk about here are involve something called code minors. So if you've studied like graph minors, for example, you can think of this as very much an analogy to that situation. And basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and think about a way that codes are actually related to each other, and hopefully this is going to capture something about the geometry of my realization. And I'm going to start off with some definitions that seem kind of weird and not that motivated, but once we get past this slide, we'll see that they actually do have some relevance to this question. Yeah, just notationally, if I have a code and some set of indices sigma, I'm going to talk about something called the trunk of that set of indices in my code. All I'm going to do is collect together the code words that contain this set of indices. And why on earth would I do such a thing? This is just a purely combinatorial kind of nonsense construction, it seems like. But it turns out the code words in the trunk of sigma can sort of be thought about geometrically as coming from points inside of U sigma. And remember, U sigma is just the intersection of all the UIs with I and sigma. So I won't talk too much about the details of sort of why this intuition or geometric sort of fact plays out. But we will see that if we accept this intuition in the back of our head, we'll see this has some nice consequences for thinking about codes. And the other thing that I want to define is just a notion of a morphism between codes. All this is going to be is just a function where the pre-image of a trunk in one code is a trunk in the domain. So it's kind of like a continuous function if we're thinking about our trunks as open sets, but it's not quite the same. There's not like a topology lurking in the background. But yeah, I want to be able to pull trunks back to trunks. And let me give a concrete example of this. So here I've got two codes. One on the left is not convex. The one on the right turns out that it is. And I've drawn them as partially ordered sets. So 1, 2 is a maximal code word on the left because it contains 1 and the empty set, and no other code word contains 1, 2. And these codes as partially ordered sets, they look really similar, but the difference is on the left-hand side I have this 2, 3, and on the right-hand side I have this 3, 4. That's the only difference between these two codes. So let's actually highlight all the trunks that exist in these. So here I've drawn, for example, on the left-hand side, I have the trunk that contains all my code words. that's like the trunk of the empty set. If I look at the set of code words that contain 1, then that's this sort of left-hand side set containing 1 and 2, 1 and 1, 2. And then if I look at the trunk of 2, for example, then that's the set of both maximal code words here. They both contain 2, and there aren't any other code words that contain 2, so on and so forth. And we can see that the set of trunks is different in these two codes, even though as partially ordered sets, they look the same. And as a consequence of that, so if I go from left to right by sort of mapping in the natural way, 1, 2 to 1, 2, 1 to 1, and so on and so forth, 2, 3 going to 3, 4, that turns out that it is a morphism in this sense I just described. Whereas on the other hand, if I go from right to left, taking the inverse of that bijective function, that's not a morphism, because if I tried to take the pre-image of this set containing 1, 2, and 2, 3, on the right-hand side, that's not a trunk anymore. So that's not going to be a valid morphism. And so that's why we don't want to think of this quite as like a topology, because the topology these trunks generate in both these cases is actually the same topology. Okay, so that's a concrete example of how these things behave. If that's a little bit, wonky and opaque, that's okay. The main sort of thing that I want to actually use about these morphisms is not the nitty-gritty of their structure, it's just that they sort of exist. And I'm going to state a result that tells us something about how they play with the geometry of our realizations in just a second. So before I state that, I'm going to put a partial order on all of my codes. And how do I do this? Well, I'm going to call a code C a minor of a code D if I can find a surjective morphism from D to C. And so I can actually partially order all of my codes by saying, when can I find a surjective map between them? So codes higher up in my partial order are ones that have surjective maps to stuff lower in my partial order. And really, we're partially ordering isomorphism classes, but for the purpose of this talk, we really don't need to worry about that too much. Okay, so this notion of minors and morphisms and things like this actually does have something to do with open embedding dimension. In particular, the open embedding dimension is a, say, a monotone function on this partially ordered set. Another way to say it is, if a code C is above a code D, or I guess I've stated it opposite here, if D is above C, then the open embedding dimension of D is at least as large as the open embedding dimension of C. So as I go higher in my coset, the open embedding dimension actually goes up. Might not go up strictly at every step, but it can't go down. And yeah, again, I won't say too much about the proof, but just wanted to vaguely gesture at why it's true. This statement that I made earlier about these U sigmas, the code words in those geometrically corresponding to code words in a trunk, is sort of the main thing we use. It turns out every surjective morphism corresponds to a certain choice of trunks in the domain, and then those geometrically correspond to these U sigmas, and it turns out the image of the code D is something that records the code of your sort of chosen regions. So you can really, this sort of result here is really constructive, is maybe the moral of that story. We can always take a realization for a code D, and if I have a minor of that code, I can use that realization to build one for the thing below. Yeah, so the main point here is that I have this totally combinatorial way to partially order all my codes, but it does tell us something about the geometry, in particular about the open embedding dimension. And just to give us a little bit of intuition, so here's all my codes. I've represented them as red dots. Of course, there's infinitely many, so this is maybe a finite subset of all the codes. And this notion of minors gives us a way to partially order them. Here I've drawn the Hasse diagram, the covering relations. And then this result I just stated tells us that this actually stratifies in a nice way the codes by open embedding dimension. So of course I have this region where the open embedding dimension is infinite. And then if I look at the place where it's finite, so I have stuff with dimension 3 sitting above dimension 2, above dimension 1, and so on. Okay, so with that framework set up, I'm going to define another family of codes that is sort of similar to these S sub n codes that I talked about earlier, but they're going to be a little bit more general, and these are going to be the codes that are sort of interesting and maybe give us the punchline in this talk. So if I have a simplicial complex, That's, I didn't define what it is, but you can just think of it as a code that's closed under taking subsets of your code words. And I can always use this simplicial complex to define a code that I'm going to call Ssubdelta. Delta is my simplicial complex. And how do I do it? So I take delta, and then I join it with a new neuron. So this delta join new neuron, all that is a sort of cone over my simplicial complex. And then I'm going to add just one code word to this, and that's the code word containing the neurons 1 through n. And if we want to think about how this sort of treats the partially ordered set of your code, so I start off with some simplicial complex where I have some facets, and then everything below them is also in my code. I'm going to sort of thicken my poset a little bit by adding this new neuron and sort of copying everything over a little bit. And then I'm going to add a new code word. And this new code word, the important thing about it is that it contains all of the facets of my simplicial complex delta, because these were just facets on neurons 1 through n. And so these are no longer going to be maximal code words. This n is going to be a maximal code word that contains all of those. Cool.
And that's sort of a picture in the Hasse diagram. Is that right?
Yes, this is very much in the Hasse diagram, not like a geometric realization of your simplicial complex.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Yeah. Yeah. So these turn out to be useful for the following reasons. So on the one hand, if my simplicial complex delta has m facets, then it turns out S sub m, so this is the sunflower with m petal type of code that I described earlier, is a minor of S delta. And moreover, this S delta actually turns out to be intersection complete. I've just taken a simplicial complex and added a single new code word to it. That's going to maintain intersection completeness. Okay, so moral of that statement that I just made is that if my delta has m facets, then the open embedding dimension of S delta is equal to m. And here's the proof. So on the one hand, I can find a realization in Rm using some past results that people have about intersection complete codes. On the other hand, I can't find a realization in a lower dimension because of this structure in minors in this partial order on all codes. I know since the open dimension of Sm is equal to m, and it's a minor of S delta, this open embedding dimension of S delta is at least as large. And if we want to sort of zoom back into our intuitive picture, one way to think about this in this partial order is the following. So I have all my possible S deltas with m facets, and Sm sits as a minor of all of those. So if I collect all these together and look at that sort of sub-poset, it has a unique minimal element, which is Sm. And we know that these actually sit right in this layer where the open dimension is equal to exactly m. Okay, but of course the number of facets in a simplicial complex can be much, much larger than the number of vertices, right? And so in particular, this tells us that the open embedding dimension can be exponentially large in terms of the number of, in this framework of neural codes, quote unquote neurons, which are the, yeah, in my simplicial complex, those would be vertices. In particular, it could be n-1, choose n-1 over 2, roughly. And the sort of reason this ends up happening, one way to think about it again is, if I think about this partial order on all my codes, I said the open embedding dimension is really nice as we walk through there. As I walk up, the open embedding dimension can never go down. But it turns out the number of neurons very much can go down, and that's exactly what's sort of behind this phenomenon where the open embedding dimension gets very, very large, is that as I walk around in my poset, the number of neurons changes quite drastically in ways that are not exactly compatible with the partial order structure. But maybe the main moral of the story here that's interesting is, from a very theoretical, sort of removed mathematical perspective, what this is saying is that in this framework of neural codes, n neurons can recognize a dimension that is larger than n. And that's, I don't know, to me that's kind of interesting and surprising. Who knows if it occurs in any sort of meaningful experimental way or, in the wild, so to speak. That's something that I have not enough expertise to say, but even in this theoretical framework, I think this is kind of a fun and interesting phenomenon to observe. So in the last 5 minutes, I want to state a generalization and hopefully a really nice and fun to think about open problem. So I promised a generalization of this sunflower theorem that I stated before, and it turns out that, yeah, this statement that I made that was true in dimension B can actually be even sort of widened a little bit more. And in particular, sunflowers themselves are a pretty restrictive structure, right? There's not much I can say about the code words that show up. They have to be either everything all at once, or a singleton, or empty. And if we want to actually, use these results in a broad way, we'd hope to have something a little bit more robust than that. So I'll define a notion of a quote-unquote k-flexible sunflower. And here the restriction I'm going to place is that, so I still have my code word of 1 through n where all the sets meet. And then I'm just going to say outside of that central region, not too many sets show up at once. I'm going to let k sets show up at once, but not more than that, or k neurons show up at once, but not more. And so when k equals 1, these are just the same sunflowers as before. But here's an example of k equals 2. So here I have a 2 flexible sunflower with 5 petals in R2, and the central region is just a square, and outside of that, the sets do overlap, but no more than 2 at a time. So I'm sort of controlling how much overlap I get outside of the center.
Quick question.
Yeah.
Do you require that all code words containing at most k neurons are in the code, or just you allow up to k neuron code words?
Yeah, so I'm gonna allow anything you want as long as it doesn't violate this condition. So you could include everything, you might not. Yeah, thanks for asking, because we definitely want this to apply in the most general way. And so you can just think of k as a parameter that's bounding sort of the size of your code words besides this code word n, but I don't really care otherwise what those code words are. Cool. So before we had this statement for normal sunflowers that if I sampled a point from enough petals and took the convex hull, I had to hit the center. And again, we're going to have the same sort of result. If I have a k-flexible sunflower with n petals in RD, so I have 3 sort of parameters there, then if I choose a point in every petal, then I am going to hit the center of my sunflower when I take the convex hull, as long as a certain relationship between k, n, and d is satisfied. So before I needed at least d plus 1 petals, and now things don't change actually all that much. I just need d times k plus 1. So when k equals 1, this really is the same result we had before. And yeah, just to give a slight comment about the proof, so this is a situation where the proof ends up being much nicer than the original sunflower theorem proof. We can apply Tverberg's theorem, and when k equals 1, this really becomes Redon's theorem, and it turns into this proof that Rosen had originally suggested, but which I wasn't able to wrap my head around when I originally proved it. Yeah, here we have a nice general way to do it, and we recover even a nicer proof of the original result. Yeah, here's an example of 5 petals, 2 flexible in R2. So this n is at least d times k plus 1. If I sample my points and take the convex hull, I see that I do touch the center. Cool. So I'm going to skip this slide and end very briefly with some nice pictures. There's one other family of codes that I think is interesting to think about, and I won't describe too much of the formality here, but this code T sub n we can think of as describing 2 sunflowers where the petals pairwise are sort of matched up and touching. And I'm going to define T sub n, lowercase t sub n, to be the smallest dimension in which I can draw such a thing. And I think it would help if I just showed you the pictures of these since we're a little bit short on time. So here is T1. I have 2 sunflowers with 1 petal each, and the petals are overlapping. Here I have 2 sunflowers with 2 petals each, and the petals are sort of pairwise matched up. On the left-hand side, I have a sunflower with sort of odd-numbered petals, U1 and U3. Right-hand side is U2 and U4. I can't do this in R1 because I have sort of topologically a hole. If I move up to 3 petals, then it turns out I have to move up to R3. So here I have 2 sunflowers, again, odd labeled petals on the left, even petals on the right, and pairwise matched up, 1 with 2, 3 with 4, 5 with 6. And now if I try and do this with 4 petals, what would you expect the dimension to be? So I went from 1 to 2 to 3. Maybe it should be 4. But in fact, I can actually do this still in R3. If I'm sort of clever enough with the angles that these petals come off at, I can draw a realization like this. On the other hand, once I move up to 5 petals, I do have to bump up a single dimension. And if you can figure out what happens when I have 6 petals, I would be really interested. I don't know beyond that. Some things I do know are that this t sub n number does have to blow up to infinity, and it has to take on all possible integer values. You can sort of bound it between n and n over 2, but there's sort of a lot of wiggle room in there, and I don't know how to get a handle on that. So if you have ideas, that's where I wanted to end, because I think it's a fun geometric problem to think about, and if you have ideas, I'd love to hear them. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much, Amzi, for the fantastic talk. Everyone, if you don't mind, please unmute yourself briefly, and then let's clap for Amzi before muting yourself again.
Thank you.
All right. And now we have time for questions. I'm going to be impolite and ask the first question. So Amzi, my question is, what's the smallest, is the smallest example known in terms of the number of neurons n, where you have a code on n neurons that requires a larger embedding dimension? Yeah, so what's known about the smallest number of neurons needed to obtain that?
Good question. So I guess that's the smallest n that has n minus 1, choose n minus 1 over 2, larger than n.
I see.
Which I've not computed off the top of my head, but that would be the smallest example that I know of.
Yeah, you should find it, and if it's small enough, draw a picture of it, but it might be too high dimensional to visualize, I suppose. All right.
I wonder if you could get away with a picture in R3 or not.
Yeah. Other questions?
Yeah, I would have a question about the K flexible sunflower. So it seems to me that in terms of the embedding dimension, it's not just sort of restricted by the level, but also sort of the or just the number of, or how many neurons you allow to intersect besides the center, but also sort of just the cross section. Like it for example, just in what you have here, the fact that it's just U1 intersecting U2 and not U1 also intersecting U5, or it seems like the number of intersections would also kind of, the number of different intersections, not just the I guess the level of neurons intersecting would play an important role. Is that true? Or
yeah, so I can say the following. So if I'm understanding your question correctly, yeah. If we want to use this to bound embedding dimension, then your suggestion is that not only should the existence of these code words with weight k play a role, the number of them should also have something to do with it. If I have fewer code words of weight k, then my embedding dimension should be perhaps larger because I'm having less overlap, something like that. Right. So I think that the result that I came to when I tried to think about this last summer was that the number of code words of weight k has to be at least k, I think, for this to sort of have any meaning. But then beyond that, there wasn't much to say. Like there was sort of just a threshold where discretely, if you had fewer than these number of code words of weight k, then you could just reduce to a case where k was smaller. And if you had larger than that number, then sort of things were not well controlled. So there wasn't like a, I guess, smooth, nice dependence to write down in that question. Yeah, I'm trying to think of how to sort of describe that situation in the best possible way. Basically, there is something you can say, but there's only one sort of cutoff point. So it's kind of hard to apply it in a general way.
you.
Further questions?
Yeah, I have a question. I noticed that you referenced the neural ring paper. Do you use any of the ring things in your proofs or stuff?
Yeah, so this stuff that I've talked about, I have not used any of the ring structure at all.
I see.
I guess one thing I can say is that if we go back to this stuff, this notion of morphism, you can sort of formulate a ring theoretic version of all this. You can talk about, I mean, every morphism of codes induces sort of a contravariant thing between rings, and you can describe those as certain morphisms of rings that basically you want the image of a monomial to be a monomial again. But I haven't been able to like I can say that fact, but I haven't been able to use that fact to prove anything. Maybe somebody with more, commutative algebra knowledge would be interested in that to be able to say something. But yeah, the algebraic formulation of all this stuff, I haven't been able to sort of get mileage out of as far as proving bounds on dimension or convexity or things like that.
Okay, thank you.
Amzi, I had one more small question. What's sort of the first example I should be thinking of simplicial complexes where the number of facets is exponential in the number of vertices? Is it the cross polytope?
I guess
go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, no. In this talk, I think that or in this paper, I guess the example that I was thinking of is just the n/2 full skeleton of a simplex.
I see.
So, include all, I guess you'd say all faces of size up to a half of the number of vertices you have.
Gotcha.
And there you have a lot going on in the middle.
Yep.
Actually, I don't know if that's the largest number of facets you could possibly have. But it is at least exponential. Yeah.
It is, because there's that theorem about like transversals or the longest antichain in a poset. And I think that's the bound you get. So that is the longest.
Huh.
Okay.
Yeah, Dilworth's theorem.
Dilbert?
Dilworth. Although I do also often call it Dilbert's theorem.
Dilworth. Any further questions? Well, thank you so much, Amzi, for the wonderful talk, and thank you all for joining today.